Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 383rd New Social Environment. I am Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation with Mitch Epstein and Robert Slifkin. We're thrilled to also have the poet Charles Valle here, who will read to close today's program. A few quick notes before we get started. The Rail team will be helping out with tech if you have any questions. Closed captions are available by pressing the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we started all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. The heart of both of these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all who struggle for freedom, in recognition that when it comes to liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation, as spoken by the great Angela Davis. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions that we will be posting shortly. But for now, I'd like to introduce today's guest and host. Artist Mitch Epstein is a photographer who helped pioneer fine art color photography in the 1970s. Published by Steidl Verlag, Property Rights, his current book, is a collection of photographs and short texts examining the American government's ongoing legacy of property confiscation and how communities gather to resist. In 2020, Epstein was inducted as an academician to the National Academy of Design. Writer and scholar Robert Slifkin is an associate professor of fine arts at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. His most recent book is The New Monuments and the End of Man, U.S. Sculpture Between War and Peace, 1945 to 1975, from Princeton University Press. And without further ado, I will hand the mic over to you, Robert.
Great. Thank you, Nick. It's a real pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to speak with Mitch about this book, Property Rights. I don't know if it's going to be, I have a copy here, and I kind of wanted to show it, not just only because cover is an amazing image that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about later, but just to get a sense of the scale and ambition of this project. It's a large book, I guess, with about, 270 images. Is that right, Mitch?
There's 190 something plates and a handful of artifacts or drawings that, but mostly photographs, yes.
Exactly, so 170 images, and as well as a collection of first-person testimonials from some of the subjects that you photographed and worked with. And it's, as in our discussion prior to going on, you described it as almost novelistic in the sense that it has 9 chapters, and each of the chapters represents, in some ways, a different region of the United States, right? So, I mean, this is a project, this book encompasses 4 years of work where you really did traverse all corners of the United States, including non-continental US, Hawaii. Did you make it to Alaska as well? I think
not on this project.
Not on this project. I know you were up there for other things, right? So, but anyhow, I thought it would be good to begin our conversation just talking about the kind of scope and scale and ambition of this project and kind of the origins of it. You know, how did it begin for you?
It began in the winter of 2017. In brief, I went to the Women's March in Washington the day after Trump was inaugurated into the White House, the presidency, and decided to go a week later out to Standing Rock as the Dakota Access Pipeline environmental review was called into question by the Trump administration. There were still many holdouts at the Standing Rock site, and just went out there on a leap of faith, spent a couple of weeks there, and also going down to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And it was the experience of being there as an outsider, as somebody who was coming into that territory very late, and listening to largely matriarchal elders who agreed to be interviewed, to have conversations with me, who spoke about why they were there, what it meant to them, and also made me rethink some of the American history that I had learned about, but really in an inadequate kind of way. So at Standing Rock, I made portraits. I tried to make pictures that would speak to the determinism of people who were there. This picture that we're looking at now was made at one of the encampments called Rosebud. It was a security entrance point. And I think it speaks to the kind of harsh, but also kind of this kind of de facto set of conditions here, which are very basic. And I set up a conversation with the security guard who was white, but had claimed a Native American identity, with a Native American, a Lakota Nation member, and tried to create a scenario that in some way spoke to this conversation that was taking place between multiple tribal nations and insiders, outsiders, and to look also at how to make pictures that were drawing, as I do, from a documentary tradition, but also feeling the freedom to let them be somewhat staged. So, but it was the experience of Standing Rock, of being there, and every elder spoke about broken treaty rights, and that's what encouraged me to go back to the Dakotas on multiple trips, but to think about these people who were willing to put their lives on their line. Many of them got arrested along the year and a half that Standing Rock was at play. And so that led me to look in a larger, more continental way, as you've mentioned, Rob, at various resistance actions, various kinds of conflict that initially really related to conflicts between industry and community, and then thinking also about our heated southern borderlands and the cultural and human landscape around the border and what was being called into question there, the conflicts, which in some way also extend to the notion of property. And down the road, 2 or 3 years later, I had long been thinking about how to think about the body as a form of property. And when COVID came, of course, that was a illuminating moment where all of a sudden our bodies were more vulnerable than ever. But especially for people of color, for indigenous people, for the disenfranchised people of our country, who were even more at risk because of their economic status, their difficulties to insulate themselves from this really rampant invasive disease. And so I had already been photographing and asking questions about monuments to the history of African Americans and to African Americans in our country, but I also photographed some of the Black Lives Matter protests as well, which in a way become a kind of a conclusion, if you will, an extension of the meaning and reading of the very definition of property rights. So I think we can maybe just, that's a fair.
Yeah, and maybe we can spend a moment on this really interesting, complex photograph that you began with, and you described something you said that you wanted to kind of document this protest, but also recognize that these are somewhat staged images, and that you're working with a large format camera for most of these photographs. Is that right?
Right. So here I have these really the vast majority of the pictures for the project and at Standing Rock were made with an 8x10" format camera. So I'm working on a tripod. It takes time. I immediately have to, and even just to get into Standing Rock, it reminded me a bit of going to Vietnam in the early 90s in terms of what it took to gain the confidence of those there that were going to welcome me in, the trust. So, here again, I had to, secure permission. But then, and in general, I felt like I did have a kind of freedom. And here, what I was struck by was just this sort of the rich array of objects and signage, and even how, like, water is life, Minnie Wiconi, this was the mantra at Standing Rock. And when you look closely at water is life, it's kind of, letters are kind of wonderfully cut out from some maybe fabric, that was purchased at Walmart or something like that. So there's something very kind of homespun. On the left, you look at because the snow has just melted. And there's some kind of a sled-like device that people were using to take in provisions and back out. So I'm interested in the way in which time gets illuminated in the picture, from the billowing tarp. You see that there's cut wood for a wood fireplace on the interior of the structure. Whether it's the heat from the fire or wind, you have this kind of movement where there's this extension of the structure. There's a dog moving in the background, but it's also the fact that some of these things, these artifacts, were put to use and now are not being put to use. So this reference of past history, just at Standing Rock itself.
Yeah, the sign, water is life, seems so crucial to, I think, a lot of the themes that run throughout the book, in the sense that it suggests this affinity between the natural world and the human world, the sense that the human world, the life of the human, is dependent on water. I mean, maybe it's worth just understanding why water is life would be the mantra of the Standing Rock protest against the pipeline. Right, the pipeline is about gas, which is of course a theme that runs through, or energy, all these forms of resource extraction that runs through many of the chapters of the book. But why is water is life related to the protest against the pipeline?
Pointedly, it was the pipeline that was passing one under the Missouri River, and other sacred sites, but was, in essence, putting the water sources for the tribal nations of the Lakota people at risk. And so, in fact, it was, under the Obama presidency, the political forces pushed for an Army Corps review of the pipeline and the environmental risks that were at hand, and that's what basically Trump turned around. But I think it's really, for me, the thing that was really important was thinking hard about the Native American relationship to water, that they don't take water for granted, that they don't take the universe, the grace of what has been given to them, nature as they see it. And so the water is what became the kind of the symbolic currency that had to be protected. And I think metaphorically, it represents our bodies are mostly water. Without water, there is no life. And so I think it it just becomes a kind of a poignant symbol.
Yeah, and I've drawn to the way that that sign is kind of echoed in terms of the rectangular format, and even the way the kind of blue letters echo the solar panel just to its left and below it, right? That these two central resources, water and sun, are both there. And you know, thinking about it's not in this image, but it's in so many of the other pictures from Standing Rock. There's resource extraction that has to do with fossil fuels and has to do with natural gas in the images you make in Lancaster. And then there are these other resources that are water and sun, which are renewable, and it's a, you know, non-extractive, do not require refining. So it's an interesting dynamic that you've set up. The other facet of this image that I think is worth talking about as it sets up a theme that runs throughout the book is the way that a picture like this seems to waver between portraiture and landscape, and the way, and this I think again is in some ways thematized in Water is Life, that there's some relationship between humans and the landscape that these photographs are exploring.
Well, I think that, you know, every picture has a central focal point, and the essential focal point for me, as I focus the camera and then build the picture around that focal point, is the conversation between these two men. And it was their engagement, the fact that it's a Native American speaking to a Caucasian American who's claiming a Native identity in his name. And so portraiture is, it's you know, I rarely make pictures that are without some human habitation or some human presence or the suggestion of human presence. And I don't get in a way distracted by genre. I listen by instinct to what moves and excites or unnerves me as I'm out in the world, and then allow myself to build pictures around that initial response and to let it be elastic. You know, the world, it's confusing because when you're out in it as a photographer, really for anybody, it's confounding how much it is that one has to contend with. But I think for me, once I face a subject or a scenario that's that I commit to, I see ways in which I can build landscape even within portraiture or even within still life. I'm not really so interested in the restriction of genre in a traditional way. So, but you might have more insight to this.
No, I think that's right. That there's something about these works that is precisely confusing those genres, and not just in a kind of formalistic way, but rather in terms of the kind of message of the book, which has to do precisely with the crucial imbrication of humans in the landscape and the kind of perilous implications of our not paying attention to that relationship. And maybe in that sense, we can kind of move to the first image, Nick.
Just add one thing, which is
go for it.
That even here, there is the, you know, I mean, obviously the Standing Rock was a beautiful example of people putting themselves at risk to be stewards of the land, and to think in the big picture and forward think about environmental concerns and challenges. But inevitably, you know, even here you can see that amongst the detritus, there are things made of plastic, and there's another picture that I have from the Sacred Stone camp, where at the very center, there's a man holding a canister with propane natural gas. And so even for all of us in these kind of scenarios, we're still very dependent upon the energy systems that are in place. But now we can move forward.
Yeah, and that I mean, you brought up a little bit already this idea of the way that an image like this contains time, and I think that's something that so many of these works do, and in the way that even water is a generational issue for all of us, but maybe particularly for the residents of Standing Rock, in the sense that it's thinking about future generations and will there be water for them. That there's a way that these issues take on a kind of long historical trajectory. And I think this relates to what, in my opinion, is another central theme of this work, and one that relates to my own thinking in terms of my own research, which is monumentality. And I want to think about the first image that we've selected, which is from National Staircase Monument in Utah, right? Nick, can you move the slides to that image?
Number one.
Yeah, there we are. And maybe again, to maybe even situate this photograph within the project. So how do you get from Standing Rock to a national park, and moreover, begin to photograph natural phenomenon, right?
So while I was at Standing Rock, the Interior Secretary Zinke was advising Trump to call into question many of the national monument sites, which are managed by the Bureau of Land Management, in particular Bears Ears and Grand Staircase and Escalante, which were appointed as protected sites by past presidents. And so this was already within the kind of political maelstrom of the time. And as the project developed, I felt it was important to go to some of these sites, some of them which do reference past histories, but also are sites of extraordinary natural wonder, but they're not trafficked in the way our national parks are. So the question that I asked myself is how does one picture a geological formation like this that goes back in some cases hundreds of millions of years and bring any kind of meaning to it? And it is challenging, but I felt that it was important to be making these pictures. In this case, I was thinking about what was going on here. So part of it becomes almost otherworldly in a way, because it looks like it's lit by sunlight, but it is sunlight, but it's sunlight that's being reflected off the mountain scape behind me in the afternoon. So there's a kind of a glowing illumination. And I think by being down below and looking up, to me, in a formal way, it's like the bow of a ship that's kind of coming toward you. So it's very imposing, and I think I set the picture up in such a way that you have to face off this landscape. And just to add, I mean, I don't make the pictures really thinking about the book or as being part of a narrative. I make the pictures first, one by one, and test them out. Can they hold the wall? Can they work as an individual singular work of art, as an image? And so really I made this with the intention of being much larger. So you would be seeing it at a scale that you would have to contend with it as.
Yeah, I mean, scale is relative, and even seeing it on my very small laptop screen right now, what I'm struck by is the size of the rock outcropping to the trees and bushes below it. That you cannot deny a kind of inherent monumentality to this natural phenomenon. And for me, it makes me think about how this notion of monumentality, which is the final chapter of the book, and we'll get to that, where you actually begin photographing the contested Confederate monuments mainly in the American South, but that these were monuments for indigenous people, right? That these spaces that we as the United States then designated as national monuments were already functioning in similar ways that we associate monuments to function in terms of ways of orientating ourselves in space and time. Right? I think about this even more in terms of another photograph from the series. If you can move, Nick, to the next image of, I think it's Goosenecks National. No. Oh, well, we could look at this as well.
This is at Bears here. It's called, the site is called Newspaper Rock, but it's these pictograph drawings date back 1,000 years or so, and they are markings by indigenous peoples of that time, but considered by many to, in a way, have been done over time. They call it newspaper rock because people may have sent messages one to another, or left some imprint of their passage. And so, yeah, I mean, the thing about Bears Ears, there were 5 tribal nations that were at stake and that had, profound histories on that land. And so, in a sense, the Trump administration's decision to roll back the site by 85% was a kind of a direct insult to those tribal nations.
That's right, and I love this image because, again, it suggests the imbrication of the natural world and the human world, and one that has almost a kind of prehistoric genealogy, right? This is not just a modern dynamic. This is kind of fundamental to human relationship to the landscape, and that the landscape almost becomes a kind of text. And this is another theme that I think runs through the book, is a kind of interest in signage. We saw it already in The Water is Life, right? The way that language and text and symbolism is imprinted upon the landscape in a certain way. If we go to the next image, I think it's of the goose.
I'd go back to one thing I'll add, because, light, I mean, the tools that we have as photographers are, they're limited, but one of the primary tools within any photographic practice is light. And I'm often using light in a way to infer time. And so here, the sun is setting behind the mountain that's behind me. So it's like a curtain that's slowly kind of rising from the bottom up. And so I chose to make that picture really at that moment where it's part in highlight and part in shadow, because I think that it infers a sense of time that relates to the image's content or narrative.
It makes me think about the way that kind of one of the most, one might say, primordial forms of monumentality, something like the obelisk, is in some ways a very basic sundial, right? That monuments, or Stonehenge would be another great example of this, where the very essence of the monument is aligned to the movement of the sun. And that, I think, both of the images we've already seen, and as well as the next one at Goosenecks National Park, are all both, I mean, you can orient the camera in relation to the placement of the sun, as you've described. What strikes me about this image is the way that the geologic strata is doing this, and again, that the natural world itself is marking time, right? The camera is marking time through its registration of the movement of the sun. We'll see various monuments and that seek to mark time in a very human way. But here we have the natural world almost doing it automatically just by the display of these geologic strata. And the movement of the river, right? The river itself coursing through is a marker of deep time.
Yeah, I mean, these photographs from these sites became a kind of a prologue, an entranceway into the multiple narratives of the project, because I wanted um, to create a landscape, to create that referred back to time on these lands before colonization, before the white settlement of North America. And I think, interestingly, since you've thought a lot about land art, you know, when you see a site like this that is got all this kind of layering, that you know, it's a kind of a, you know, seems to me that it's a beautiful precedent to what followed, you know, in the 20th century with artists working with land art on a monumental scale.
I think that's right. You could go from this image to newspaper rock to spiral jetty and see they're all forms of inscription on the landscape at various ways. I think that's absolutely right. Making, you know, the way, I mean, or just the way that land signifies, right? Whether it signifies through human intervention or, again, I think what's so remarkable about this image is it suggests that, you know, there might be examples of what we could call something like biosemiosis or geosemiosis, right? That these non-human entities have their own forms of sign making that I think you know, we should probably be more attentive to than we are.
Yeah, I mean, the big challenge was also for me with photographing landscapes like this is how to animate them without personifying them. How, you know, and how, you know, with the project as a whole, to give voice to land itself, to nature, as a fundamental element that has its own rights, that we it's not up for us to just basically define what the rights of nature are for nature. And I think that this is one of the conundrums and you know, of our time, but certainly something that I was thinking about as I made these pictures.
Absolutely. And I, you know, the title of the book, Property Rights, and then you see images like this, it brings to the fore, as do other images we'll see shortly, where you start to think about questions of fences and walls. What is the difference between land, landscape, and property, right? Not all landscape is property, or at least maybe not all landscape was always property. It seems increasingly that all landscape is property, but that's right, that this is a kind of reminder that there's a difference between those two things, and that there are various ways of engaging with the natural world that needn't be understood in terms of proprietary ownership.
Right. No, I agree with that.
But I think that's really one of the fundamental themes of this body of work, is to kind of recognize how much that notion of property has infused our relationship to the natural world.
Well, I think in particular in the West, because
yeah, you say "are," that's what I mean. Yes, yeah, exactly.
Here, it led to the concept of manifest destiny and a kind of deep ownership of the land in a kind of, you know, philosophical way. And so while and that I think is it really, you know, that in some profound way is at the sort of attitudinal part of Americans. And so when one thinks of the, you know, the Greek philosophers and the debate about property, it gets broken down to common, collective, and private. And I think generationally, you know, we have moved more toward a concept of ownership that is private.
Yes.
And that's what we're up against now.
Exactly, yeah. Let's move on to the next image. So this seems like a crucial image as well in terms of the message of the book. It might not be immediately evident to all the viewers what we're looking at, but it's Mount Rushmore seen through fog. And I think two striking things about this image are your choice to occlude the presidents in fog, which suggests, again, a kind of natural overcoming of the cultural, right? What I think about the last scene in Planet of the Apes, where Charlton Heston's character finds the torch of the Statue of Liberty kind of half buried on a beach, right? That this kind of, it's the essence of the ruin, right? Where the forces of nature take over the attempts by humanity to overcome them. So you have that. And then also the really, I think, startling decision to show the talus field underneath the sculpture, right? The statues of the presidents, which typically is not included in representations of Mount Rushmore, which both kind of diminishes, I think, the grandeur of the image, but also, again, is a reminder of the kind of entropic future of all human endeavors, right? That this is going to end up as dust in a certain way. But and also it sets the theme of monumentality. And I'd just add one more thing: people and nature. Right? These are representations of people carved into the natural landscape, somewhat like newspaper rock.
Yeah, I didn't know that I could pull off a picture at Rushmore because it is so loaded and photographically contrived. And people at Pine Ridge on the reservation, some said, "Don't go, we're not going to talk to you," and some said, "You have to go." But to be honest, when I went in 2018, I thought back to the fact that in 1966, I went as a young boy on a YMCA cross-country trip, and I had no idea that Rushmore was a sacred site to the Lakota people called Six Grandfathers. So already this embedded history was on my mind. And the rain for me, this happens to be an image that that's got limits on a screen, even a large screen, because you have to get up close to look at the faces, and the rain creates these kind of metaphorical tears that are coming down the president's faces. So that is, in a way, for me, the kind of focal point. But as you mentioned, the shot rock, the consequence of our actions gets played out in the picture. There's a tiny American flag kind of in the lower left corner, sort of a punctuation. But so this is the picture that sort of transitions into the Standing Rock passage of the book. One that relates to the fact that in time, this will also, the erosion these faces will disappear. But that it has been so kind of, we've so attached ourselves to this as a kind of a patriotic symbol that I think really should be called into deep question.
Right. I mean, we've spent a long time looking at these images from the prologue of the book, but I think it's important because they do in many ways establish the central themes. And that's one of the achievements of the book, is that it really does function as a cohesive statement, which, as someone who studies photo books, it's always something you're looking for, is that, is it just a kind of catalog or a collection of photographs, or is it really function as a book? And I think, this really has those themes, and the more that you look through the book, the more that you see the way that these early themes play out throughout the various chapters. So maybe we should, so we don't run out of time, and I do want to kind of give everyone watching a sense of, again, the scope and ambition of this project, which is truly remarkable. So maybe we should move on. I think the next one was one we already saw, so we should go forward one more. And this is still from South Dakota, am I right?
This is in North Dakota, where I went back to photograph a prayer walk in remembrance of the Standing Rock Resistance Action, those that had been arrested. And so this was made in a hotel. It was a prayer walk that went from the site of the resistance actions on the Standing Rock Reservation all the way to Bismarck, North Dakota. And it was in Bismarck, in the hotel, where there was a ceremony with these people that were part of the prayer walk. So.
What strikes me about this image is the hoodie that the figure on the right is wearing that says "I am hip hop," which again I think in some ways relates to this kind of multi-temporal monumentality theme. That the idea that one way of understanding monuments is in this kind of cosmic temporal orientation that aligns the past to the present and imagines a future. And here we have these four figures playing traditional music with some kind of electronic amplification, right? They're microphones and cables. And then you also have the sense that contemporary popular music is inflecting this music as well. And this is something that one of the subjects that you quote in the small written passages that intersperse the images says, that as a Lakota, or I'm always moving between two worlds, right? The world of the reservation and the world of the white world, and that's part of what it means to exist in this world.
I think that this picture embodies that, the fact that they are focused. They are in their drumming meditative state, but within an environment that's got nothing to do with them per se. And so that's interesting to me. And I think it does lead into the Alex Whiteplume portraits. We could jump to those.
Yeah, those. I think they're next, or there might be one image between them, but we should go to this. Let's move to the portraits first. Yeah.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Alex Whiteplume on Pine Ridge. And we could maybe just see all of the elements that we can cover this more quickly. You see him here dressed in his Western garb. And he said to me, "Would you like to see my bonnet passed down from me by my grandfather?" So the next image. So he's still sitting in the same place. And so you have this duality of personalities. And over the course of a long conversation, before I even took his portrait, where he spoke really brilliantly and beautifully, almost like a dub poet, very impassioned, he made this just off the cuff drawing. Go to the next, no, do we not have it here? Oh, we're missing that one. Oops. Well, I can show it. Sorry. I don't know what happened here. Maybe that was, but I think it's interesting just in the context of this portrait. So,
right, which is drawn on, I looked at the return address and noticed that it was the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, which is a federal institution, right? So he's getting this mail from the federal AARP, which he then diagrams his relationship to the white world on.
Right, so it really, in a way, getting me to sort of see it from his perspective. And his perspective is that in the course of a day, he's traversing, can we just go back to one of his portraits? He's traversing back and forth from the Lakota world, which he describes with two stick figures, Winyan and Wakasa, as the male-female kind of enlightened, fully realized human beings in all respects. But on the white world, it's going to the post office, it's going to the Chamber of Commerce, the Apple Store, red, white, blue. And that these two worlds, they don't really meet. They have to cross over and go back to their world, their cosmological space. And that was also a kind of a awakening for me. And so, in some ways, some of these extensions, if you will, of the work and the project were the result of conversations I had, people that I met, things that I came across. I think go back to the one of Bisbee, which is number 33. That's the next one. I think that's interesting, and it relates also to the picture that you cited from Bears Ears of newspaper rock. So, you know, I took a certain license here. I was struck by this notice board in Bisbee, which is itself a place with a troubled mining, copper mining, and labor history. But really wasn't even thinking about that per se, but just how, again, as you've mentioned, Rob, words become symbolic metaphors. So nation, sea, has a great, and the kind of layered mutilation of the staple gun and this palimpsest of papers in a way then starts, which is, as you saw, it's the cover of the book, speaks to our relationship to the land in some way through its specificity photographically.
Yeah, I think this was a really great choice for the cover, because I do think it exemplifies so many of the issues raised by this body of work, precisely in its palimpsest like layering of messages, right? Which is not that different than the layering of time that we've discussed in the monumental landscapes, and the layering of time that I think has to do with the generational fights for the preservation of resources. And it also, I think, speaks to a certain kind of inherent retrospective perspective that often occurs with photographic documentation of historical events, which again, this, I mean, one way, you said this in one of our earlier conversations, you know, in one way, this is a book that documents the Trump presidency in the United States, right? For me, I said, well, these are almost like Alexander Gardner and Timothy O'Sullivan's photographs of Civil War battlefields, right? That, and of course, they were using large format cameras as well, more just not out of a choice, but out of necessity. And as everyone knows, or anyone who's studied those images knows, you know, they couldn't take pictures of the battles. They would get there after the fact and then just get the field. And so there's this kind of retrospective representation of the historic event. And I think that plays out in so many of your images, that there's a sense that we're seeing layers of events that have passed, and we're kind of coming to it just a little behind the actual event. That in that delay, there's a kind of ability to reflect on it that might not be as present if you were in the heat of the event in some ways.
I think that there's truth to that. The detachment from the, I mean, if you go forward actually and you look at the picture of, we'll skip ahead to number 99. So it's a bit of a jump where I'm photographing Ashton Clatterbuck. Keep going. So 99. Wait. So it's let's see. Two more. Next one. Here. There you go. It's so, you know, Ashton Clatterbuck was a young boy when his parents formed and led a resistance called Lancaster Against Pipelines in Western Pennsylvania, and it also had a common goal to prevent the eminent domain takeover of land, private and public, for a natural gas pipeline that was passing through bucolic Lancaster County. But more pointedly here, related to what we were just talking about, I'm photographing Ashton. I photographed him at resistance actions, even getting arrested at a resistance action. But here, because I was very interested in the lockdown devices, the artifacts, the tools of resistance. So he's made this device, which normally might have two people who lock themselves together around a piece of construction equipment to retard the construction work going on to make a pipeline. So here he's kind of wrapped him. So he, so here it's after the fact, but he has already experienced being arrested, had this emotional intensity, and lived through this experience. So he said, I said, well, why don't we try to work together to make some pictures that that I might have some more control over with an 8x10 camera. So here he's locking himself to a tree. What does it show? I mean, it shows him in a way trying to save the tree. But I think at this point, he already understands at 16, having been part of this for 3 or 4 years, that he's also trying to save himself. And he's trying to save all of us. So to make pictures, it's very hard sometimes in the moment, in the heated moment, to always arrive at a picture that's going to have that kind of emotional resonance, depth, but also formal authority. And so there are those like this that are staged, but I don't think it, to me, there's an urgency that that transcends its stagedness.
Well, that's right. I mean, I would say that the stagedness of it operates as its own form of monumentality, in the sense that he is recreating something that did happen in the past. So there's a kind of memorial function. And the way you described it, now that this image exists in the public realm and is disseminated through reproduction, it has the potential for future action, right? So it's doing that kind of dual temporality that we associate with monumentality in a very interesting way. And that, I think it's very difficult to do that in a non-intentional way, right? It's that only happens like lightning striking, right? When you have a monument that actually, or you have an action that becomes monumental retrospectively.
I think it also speaks to the whole nature of collaboration. So, because if it's a portrait or a scenario like this, we're collaborating together. And I also see, even at times, when I'm photographing a landscape and I'm waiting for the cloud to come in front of the sun to soften the light, that's also a gift. It's also a kind of collaboration. It's the waiting to arrive at a moment where the intersection of all the elements at hand can coalesce in a way that is clear and aesthetically resolved. So
it truly is one of the kind of mysteries and gifts of photography, the way that incidents that are beyond one's control and the collaborative nature of photographer and subject, but whether that subject is a human or a natural phenomenon, that there's a kind of openness to chance that still can have significance. I think that's one of the central fascinations of the medium.
Why don't we go back to this picture, which is just before the ones of Alex Whiteblue. So it's about 10 back in the sequence from the prayer walk, because that's the one picture I think here, or one of the two that I made with a hand camera, where chance is a key player. So it's, keep going back. Yep, another one. Yeah, that one, number 8.
Yes, yeah.
At the prayer walk. Here I'm working with a hand camera. I have a shutter speed that's at least 1,000th of a second, which, with an 8x10, it's 125th. So I also participated in this walk. I had to walk it and many times run to keep up with the participants of the walk. So it was very challenging to try to photograph it. But here, where I managed to isolate these 5 walkers in profile, set against this receding, snow-covered cornfields leading back to the Missouri River and the soft horizon line across the river. So the Missouri River was symbolically what, at the core, how to protect the waters of the Missouri from the pipeline. So, but here it's something about the kinetic movement, speaking to the displacement of these Native Americans, and the road that leads the eye back to the river. So it's this intersection of these two kind of movements within, I think, that in a way creates a tension within the work. And it's in the detailing, but here, this is so to chance. I didn't know that I had this picture until I saw it later, on screen.
Yeah, and it truly is an image that is at once kind of documentary. It's just something that happened, and yet is truly iconic, right? There's something about the arrangement of the figures in space that becomes powerfully symbolic. And that, again, that's just one of the magical things that a photograph can do. And
utterly preconceived. I never could have imagined a picture like this and then start out to execute it. It would look contrived.
That's right. We have, I think, just like 5 minutes, and I want to make sure that we kind of get a sense. Again, we've more or less stayed on the West Coast, with the exception of Lancaster. And I do want just to get a sense of, how broad the scope of this project became, and that was a process, right? That as you began thinking about this notion of property rights, it led to going to the Southwest and looking at the construction of the wall, the barrier wall between the United States and Mexico, right? And you have some images of that.
We just move forward a bit here.
Yeah.
You can just even take in a couple of the images. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, here's one where the wall is cutting through the town of Nogales in southern Arizona. I think this one just in a way speaks to, as you see on the left, that's the southern side of the wall. You have this residential community on the hills, and on the American side, you basically have this desolate landscape with lights and some security monitoring. So it's the inhabited and it's the uninhabited to keep the inhabited out of the uninhabited space.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think what's so remarkable about the series of photographs you take related to the border wall is the way that the human element is always present. Maybe not visibly here, but as you note, the houses and even the surveillance camera, and then the really striking photographs that you took of the volunteers who leave water in the desert for immigrants, right?
One man, Stephen Saltonstall, who I met he works for Humane Borders, bringing water to these water stations. He became a guide, and for me, it was, he would go out, bring water, spend the day to maybe 8 or 9 water stations all throughout the Sonoran Desert. And it was a very spiritual ritual and a real privilege. And it brought me so much closer to the hardship that people faced and to thinking about the land in new ways. But why don't we just go to let's just cover a couple more pictures before we.
Yeah, I want to get a sense of, I
think this one is also important because, again, this is a saguaro cactus that was cut at Organ Pipe National Monument on the southwestern side of Arizona. This one I think is interesting, partly or provocative, because saguaro can live hundreds of years, but this one was maybe in its lifespan close to a human lifespan, maybe just over 100 years. So in a way, and this one I think does relate to Brady and to those horrific disaster of war pictures. I was not that interested in the typology of the wall, but the ways in which the wall was profoundly altering the culture of a landscape that was created based on the open passage, the open human and and an animal passage from north to south. So maybe then let's look at it just a couple. I don't know. Is there another one? Just so we get a quick overview. This is a tree sit in Western Pennsylvania. I think one of the things that this picture brings up, and was something I was going to ask you about, because I know that you addressed it in your Ugly Feelings piece on Guston, who's so in the the public light at the moment. I think within a lot of the work, I enable beauty as a foil for terror, or as a way to intersect terror. So, here you have this early summer morning that I'm making this picture that is really a beautiful scenario. At the same time, people are putting themselves at risk and camping out in these tree sits, again, to stop the eminent domain takeover and clear cutting of their land in Western Pennsylvania. And so I don't know, that whole paradigm is one that interests me, and maybe you can kind of say something about, Rob, because I know you've given some thought to it. And
well, I think it's an interesting. I hadn't thought about it in terms of this image, which is when I saw this at your show at Sycamore, it was one of my favorites, because there's something about this that seems, it's a photograph of natural beauty and kind of human ingenuity, which has its own. It's a different kind of beauty. It's not the kind of beauty that we associate with conventional notions of order, but these are people who are strategizing how to stay up in a tree for weeks on end, so to protect the landscape. And so I love this image precisely because you sense a kind of human artifice. There's a kind of intelligence to it, which again is kind of funky. It's not, it's not that kind of intelligence that we associate with high art, maybe, but it's, I would say, as intelligent as anything that one encounters in Chelsea. And so to me, I like this photograph because it sets natural beauty alongside human ingenuity, in a human ingenuity that's actually aligned with natural beauty. It's not one that's opposed to it, which so much of modernism in modern culture is, right? Human artifice as technology actually is destroying nature, right? This is something quite different. And maybe that's why it doesn't look beautiful the way we associate beauty to look like. This is what ethical beauty looks like. And maybe that's one way of understanding it in relation to Guston.
Right. So are we almost out of time?
Yeah, well, I think we are, and I don't want to run over, but I would love just to kind of give a sense of, the images that you took here in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue after the shooting, just to get a sense of how this project expanded. Maybe we can just keep moving, and some of the images from the Black Lives Matter protest right here in Washington Square. And then the images of the removal of Confederate monuments. This is in New Orleans, right?
Yeah, let me just add one thing here, because in the same way that I remembered going to Rushmore as a young boy, I photographed this Lee monument in the mid 70s, but in a way as a kind of a homage to Lee Freelander, and built this picture that was a kind of a, sort of a witty, but not necessarily lasting picture where, the Lee is standing amongst all these cables and so on and so forth. And I think, again, it speaks to the ways in which I've been fortunate, privileged to have this long working arc where I'm so much more aware of what it is that I'm looking at than I was as a young man, and am employing some of that knowledge in intuitive ways in the work. Almost done, maybe the last one, just because it also speaks to the moment with this having come down 2 days ago, the reclamation of monument.
Well, and I mean, a picture like this also, the fact that this is the final image in the book speaks to, it should resonate with images like newspaper rock, or the image of the bulletin board, right? That here we have another palimpsest, right? It's a palimpsest of graffiti on top of this monument, which has its own historical relationship, just to suggest that I think this is a really, the cohesion and complexity of this body of work is truly remarkable, especially when understood in terms of the scope of the project. And maybe that's what I would like to just emphasize. That
be the conclusion. I mean, thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think we should let's open it up to questions and have some other people speak for a moment.
Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Mitch, and thank you, Robert, for this wonderful conversation. It's lovely to spend a Friday thinking about light and photography, and I'm just very grateful to the work you've done over the years in this current work, Mitch, so thank you. Yeah, we've gotten a few questions from the audience, so let's go right into it. First, I'm going to pass the mic over to our good friend, Lynn Crawford. So Lynn, there you are.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks so much for this wonderful conversation and these wonderful images. I have a question. I've been reading, there's an Indigenous Canadian writer and performer named Thompson Highway. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he said this thing that really struck with me, how English is hierarchical, but in Cree, he says we don't have differences between animate and inanimate objects, and that rocks and trees and earth all have souls, and that he and his people look at them as a who, not a what. And I'm curious if this was part of your practice in photographing these, because a lot of your photographs certainly come off as a who, not a what. So I'm curious to hear your take on that.
I mean, I approach really everything, everyone, all of nature as living entities, and with as much respect as I can summon up. It's the cosmology and the complex philosophy of Native American cultures are ones that we have so much to learn from, just like nature itself. And as we face the kind of challenges that we face as the civilized societies that we become. So I'm not familiar with this artist, but I think that is crucial. I think the work I did, really going back to American Power, which was a series I did between 2003 and 2008, made me question in some fundamental ways my relationship to nature and to things that I inherited as a very privileged white man born in 1952, and handed all kinds of opportunity, but also with this mindset that our resources were infinite. I never questioned, as a young boy, that things had limits. Maybe Rob could respond to this. Not sure what else to add, but I would say yes, I do. I embrace who or being of things, whatever they are. So,
right. I mean, I think that's I would just say it's it speaks to the notion of property, right, and the difference between treating something as a subject and treating something as something to be subjected to, right? That I think too often we don't treat the natural world, let alone other human beings, as subjects, but rather as things that are subjected.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
Well said.
Thank you both. Thank you, Lynn, as well. And I also just want to shout out, thank you, GE, for being always so wonderfully engaging in the chat and offering your thoughts. Next, I am going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Malvika.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you so much, Mitch and Robert. I knew since yesterday that this conversation was going to be just a whirlwind, and so fantastic. I'm so excited to receive the book and spend time with it. and really loved so much of what you were talking about the relationship of land, landscape, property, thinking of the way that they're infused in the zeitgeist today is like not necessarily inherent. I feel like I was taking so many notes on things that were coming together for me as I think about kind of, we were talking about the West, but like the legacy of the colonial world, right? To be sitting in the, the experimental laboratories for like utilitarianism, for ideas of rent, for ideas of extraction, and how weird it feels to be sitting in the West in the buildings that were built on that resource extraction and that kind of strange thing. I feel like this really, I know that wasn't the gambit of your talk, but it really resonated with me in ways that I'm going to sit on for a little bit. My question, however, has to do with process, I guess. So as Robert would say, this project, and I'm sure your other projects are kind of happening on a monumental scale. And I guess I'm curious about like how a social documentary project or a practice like this book, like these sets of photographs, comes together in stages. I'm sort of wondering, like, how do you think about or notice for yourself how you kind of frame and set up a project that has such a large scope? What are the steps? Like, do you go into it and map out months of time? Is it more improvisational? That's kind of my question.
Yeah, it's I build along the way. I don't start out with an agenda. In this case, as I said, I started out by going out to Standing Rock. I came back, excuse me, one sec. I work very closely. I have a small studio. I have a studio manager, Ryan Spencer, and I also work very closely collaboratively with my wife, Susan Bell. So a lot of conversation ensues over lunch or drinks, but a lot of the work, once an idea sticks and something gets under my skin, a lot of research is conducted in the studio. That's how I found out about Lancaster, and then went out, introduced myself, was welcomed there, and was able to go out to Lancaster maybe a dozen times over a year and a half because of its close proximity. It was easy to get into the car and drive there. So it happens in a very organic way, or at times a stumbling way. There is no formula. And I think that that's both the thrill and kind of the sometimes the frustration of this kind of process, which is not really narrow in a strict sense to making a single kind of picture in a series in the way a lot of art practice takes shape. And so, it's, but it is about going back. There are pictures that I made at this one site called the Ironwood National Forest, which is where these ancient cactus live, that was also called into question. But I went back there several times over the course of a year. Or Stephen Saltonstall, who I mentioned, I must have gone on 6 or 7 water runs with him, and it was the conversations that we have. It was the people that I met. It was the retreat of COVID, the pandemic, that got me to step back with even more detachment and what it was that I had done thus far. And I, initially I had some questions. Is it my place to be photographing at a Black Lives Matter protest? I don't think in terms of myself as certainly not a photojournalist, and even as a social documentarian. I'm thinking about, how do I make a picture that's going to move me and potentially move somebody else and address the things that I'm thinking about or trying to understand in visual terms. And so that, sometimes I have to get past my own self-doubt and just step into it and find a way to make pictures that are my own within that landscape. But clearly, it became important for me to see that as a way to bring some kind of finality and closure. I didn't set out to do, the work ends up being in some way a chronicle of the Trump era, but it wasn't like I set out to do that. If I had said that to myself as the get-go, I would have gone to Bali. I mean, I would have talked myself out of it because the idea of it would have been too dreadful. I hope that's, does that answer you kind of, or, I mean, collaboration is important. You know, one of the things that we do is we use Google, we have our own Google mapping, and Ryan does these maps where, you know, for instance, with the wall, I did a lot of research. I wanted to embed myself to the degree that I could with people who were involved, mostly with humanitarian work in service to others. But I also met people who were for the wall, and that was important, including a man named Jim Chilton. And you see this one picture. Maybe we could show that one because I think it's interesting just in terms of its juxtaposition. You have the slides there, but we don't have to also, but you maybe just saw it as we were going through. It's these, it's a kind of a still life. So here's a rancher who's living, yeah, a couple more up. Number 12, 12, 12, there you go. He's living in a kind of a, you know, southwestern ranch house. That's what this sort of, you know, I don't know what color that is, but, you know, that very kind of seductive sienna color. So he's collected these artifacts, the mask, these slippers, the camouflaged water bottle, and joined them together in this display with these threatening signs, which is the first thing you see when you get to his to his property. So it was valuable to, you know, to also see, to listen and to hear what people like him had to say, even though I didn't agree with certain things he had to say. But I still felt that as we talked and spent time, that there was still a humanitarian concern on his part. He had water that migrants or even the cartel, because these could be remnants from left behind by cartel passing through there. He still had a respect for human life, and you know, so maybe he wasn't the most extreme, but I think it was important as well to try to, you know, to extend my reach. Sometimes a lot of the, you know, the thing is sometimes a lot of the material is just useful as experience or as part of the process, but doesn't become part of the final project. So I think that's what I have to say here, maybe on that one.
That was a very rigorous and detailed answer, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you both. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to our friend GE. GE, you should be able to turn your mic on. Just one moment. Okay.
Thank you so much, and thank you for documenting this. And it activates so much in what we all, in a way, can just be walking around, even in our minds without cameras, be documenting. And I was struck. I just have to say that the last picture, which you had seen earlier, which really was striking to me, and we've seen these signs that this rancher has, don't look like something he himself made. They are very glossy. They've been well produced, and you know, you got to wonder who the hell is making these things and where and all that kind of thing. So there's that kind of questioning too, which thank God you were able to document. My question has nothing to do with any of that in a way, but the question is, do you believe that, to put it kind of figuratively, that in every experience of photographic creativity, something in the past is killed as something else new in the present, in the present of the camera's click is maybe born?
I wouldn't say that I see it that way. I don't really see, I mean, at least in my practice, I'm interested in activating the past so that it has meaning, and becomes a valuable part of the present. All photographs have the past embedded, as we've spoken about, in layered and complex ways. And I think that that just the way in which, like, you saw the sign from Wounded Knee, that sign was a state register, you know, a sort of state-produced installed sign telling the simple, you know, short history of, but so somebody from Wounded Knee appropriated the sign and changed battle to massacre, but also painted it in a very particular way. So I see the past and think about it in a way that relates to, and to the whole idea of memorial or monument, in a way that is tied to the German concept Gedenkstatt, the idea of memorial as a site of not only remembrance, but also admonishment. And the ways in which Germans, at least, you know, to my limited experience in Berlin, have made a very kind of conscious, concrete effort to illuminate the history, but to do it in a way that involves education, but also to pointing toward another future. And I think that, you know, our history is so short, but as we know from the celebration of the Confederacy through monuments, we certainly weren't going about thinking about that history in that way as Americans, in my view.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mitch and GE. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to the Rail's own managing editor, Charlie Schultz. Charlie, you should be able to turn your mic on.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Mitch and Robert. This has been such a delightful conversation to listen to today. Mitch, my question's a little generic, but I am curious to get your thoughts on it. And really just thinking about how like the importance of slowness when working with your large format camera, especially in this, you know, moment in time where it's like the fastest image making apparatuses around are possible. Like, I mean, I know that your practice extends far beyond when we had these, you know, phone tools. And I'm just wondering how you think about that. Yeah, like how slow it is, you know, to not see your negative until later. And I'm also curious if you do use any kind of, like, you know, iPhone fast digital camera type thing to kind of augment the work that you do with the traditional film cameras.
Well, I'm an advocate for slow photography. I wouldn't say that I can come anywhere near to what Alice Waters has done for the farm to table food movement in America or elsewhere. But working with an 8x10 in a very organic way invites, and I think insists upon, a more introspective practice. And it is a practice, it is an instrument. And I think over time I've gained more of a command over it. But oftentimes I'm working really with time so that I can use it for its ability to render these pictures that I have a lot of control in their making, but also as you can see, there are at times things going on in the pictures that are serendipitous, and so having, you know, so it's both. I don't see it as one that is in any way subscribing to a kind of a rigid formal formulaic practice. I certainly use an iPhone as a way to sketch or scout or to make notes as I'm going along. But once I set up the camera, make a commitment to put the camera in front of a subject or whatever it is that I'm looking at, I get lost in the practice, the world, to me, upside down, where I am, and I'm looking at it closely and building a structure or building a picture, bringing all these multiple elements together is thrilling in a way. And it enables me to be more of a picture maker than taker, even though I'm out in the world. I'm not, so there's sometimes it takes, as I said, sometimes it takes going back several times over months, and sometimes it could happen in a couple minutes. But there are facilities about working with the 8x10 in terms of the way in which I can define space, define focus, and also working with film. I'm not anti-digital, I'm not a purist. I just prefer the more, in my view, the kind of the softer tonality of film. I like it to the difference between circles and squares. Digital is pixels, they're all squares that intersect. You don't see those, but they do have a kind of a hidden effect on the look and tonality of an image. So I don't want to soak up too much more time, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mitch. I really like how you define the difference between a picture maker versus a picture taker. And I do think that really relates a lot to what Robert was saying about Brady's photographs. And yeah, frankly, I think almost anyone who's working with a large format camera. Thank you so much for your time. And yeah, I'll pass it back to you, Nick. Thank you both.
A question just came in from another slow photographer, our friend Joanne Verberg. She's in Italy, and I'm going to read her question on her behalf. Joanne says, great to hear you and of your mix of, forgive me, let me start over on that. Great to hear you speak of your mix of subject matter, narratives, and choice of projects, Mitch. Can you say a bit more about the ways COVID-19 affected your perspective these last couple of years, your focus, etc.? It changed so many aspects of life, being a social and an isolated being, for example, and thinking of one's life as part of a global experience. And will these things change the way you will think about projects moving forward?
I think it's a good question, but kind of an overwhelming one that maybe I haven't even had time enough to fully digest yet. I still feel like we are, living in New York, where I am on the Lower East Side. I still feel like we are living within a realm that is dictated by the pandemic. There's so much economic hardship and tension as a result of the larger conditions and challenges we all face. I don't know. I mean, I think that property rights, in one hand, it enabled me to work collaboratively with a tremendous focus in retreat with my wife, Susan, as this project was edited. And I did further interviews and in a way gave shape to it. And I think maybe it also gave me a feeling of urgency and confidence to just do it the way that I felt it had to be done, without fear of reprisal, or that maybe some people would think this work is too political, that I'm crossing a line or a tipping point. But just getting to think about those things in some way is so, I think, essential and healthy to my practice. So while I wasn't taking a lot of things for granted already before the pandemic, I'm probably taking them even less for granted. So even though my practice and art making, I think in general, is a high risk, uncertain activity, I think it's even more so. But I think that's also spilling over into into life itself as we have set it up socially. I don't have an easy answer to the question. I think it's a good question, but I'll get back to you, Joanne, in time since I know you. But thank you and enjoy Italy.
Thank you for that generous response, Mitch. We have time just for 2 more questions. We'll fit them in. I'm gonna pass the mic now over to my colleague, Jake. Jake, you should be able to activate your mic.
Oh, hello. There we go. Hey, Mitch. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I'm a big fan. I have a copy here of Sunshine Hotel, and I was actually at the Armory yesterday and was able to get my hands on property rights. And something that crossed my mind was how beautiful the work is and how much it comes to life in these publications and the printmaking process of the book. And I know that they're both published by Steidl, and I was just wondering sort of how that relationship began and how important you think the process of bookmaking is to your work.
I'm glad you brought that up because it really is. These books are really a testament to Gerhard Steidl's respect but embrace of artistic authorship. And I met Gerhard more than 20 years ago, and the first book I did with him was Family Business, was a piece of work about my father and hometown. And in some ways, as a book that mixed many elements together, photographs, text, video, storyboards, it does have a kind of multimedia quality. And I went to him with that book as a maquette. It was 300 pages long. It wasn't it didn't promise to necessarily be a financially remunerative publication, but he just got it and was there. So along the way, it's again, it's a kind of collaboration with him because being in Steidl, you have a tremendous amount of freedom and responsibility to that freedom to make books that are worthy of the paper that they are printed on. And you have this possibility also to realize technically, and I think I've done that from book to book, refined the process. So it's a tremendous privilege, but also a relationship that I've been grateful to build on. And oftentimes I get ideas for books when I'm there because you're kind of sequestered. I think it's a little bit like bookmaking, jury duty, because you're in a library waiting for him. I mean, you have to, it's a tremendous opportunity, but also you have to takes tremendous Zen patience because he's somebody who's juggling 1,001 things at every moment. So I hope that answers your question, but thank you for both.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Can I just make one plug, which is that I've got a signing for anyone who's interested on Tuesday at Dashwood, which is the premier downtown photography book proprietor on Bond Street from 5 to 7. That's it. For property rights, and I was graced with being able to do a second book called In India, of pictures that I made in the 80s in India. That's it. Maybe that's it for questions. What do you think?
We'll definitely post a link to that event. So thank you for sharing that. The last question comment of our event is I'm going to pass the mic now over to the Rails own Fong H. Bowie. So Fong, you should be able to turn on your mic.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you so much, Robert and Mitch. What a delightful conversation and discovering how smart Robert is too. So delighted. A new friend we made. We made more friends this past year and a half on our NSE series than the last 3 years combined. For this hope and optimism for humanity. Indeed. So let me ask you this, Mitch, the question that I remember coming to New York, I saw, of course, two films, and it stayed with me still very much so. Salam Bombay and Mississippi Masala.
Mm.
You have made collaborated with your former wife, the filmmaker millionaire, and spending some time recently with Julian Schnabel in his studio. And we probably would do something similar, but I noticed how much as he became a filmmaker, a self-taught filmmaker, and there's a reference to his incredible painterly sensibility, how he referenced very much, particularly Andrei Rublev, you know, the Tarkovsky's film. I know there's a very strong, fluid reference to that filmic quality, to his painterly sensibility. So I'm sort of asking the similar question to you, Mitch. How much would the experience being making film have any direct reference to your photographic work?
Well, I think it was thank you for the question. I think it's a useful one because I came to working in film with a great appreciation of it. And in the early 70s, when I moved to New York, I devoured the independent, very author-driven European cinema, Japanese cinema, going to the art film houses. And then when I had the opportunity to work with Mira, first on her documentaries, shooting them, and then with Salam Bombay and Mississippi Masala, being involved with the cinematography, but not being the director of photography, but instead being the production designer. What happened for me was my photographic practice up until the period I worked on films was very defined by keeping myself behind the camera, more as witness, detached witness. It was the way I had been taught and a kind of a tradition of photography that I was mentored in. And so working in film in a way pushed me into the wonderful experience of shaping what was happening in front of the camera as a designer, but also having conversations with the subjects on the documentary films, getting to know them, understand them more deeply. And then as a result, I think the pictures began to change because of my greater understanding of my subject. And so, I was lucky because I basically kind of taught myself how to shoot and do camera work. And the same with production design. I mean, I had a sense of what I wanted, how I wanted things to look, and found ways to weave found locations or scenarios, and then to bring elements in together with them, where a kind of a merger of fact and fiction, and so, which is in some way, when you look at the picture of from the one of the two men talking at Rosebud, is it an installation, or is it just a kind of found, discovered, scenario? So being in India also, being thrust outside of my comfort zone as an outsider, even though I was married into Mira's family, I was still an American, and I was still always going to be a part outsider. And sort of having to sort of, in a way, distance myself from my Americanness was a very healthy thing, because that experience, as well as later spending time in Vietnam, as you know, it both gave me another perspective on things American, and it also emboldened my own confidence or courage to look at things in American, look at American things in a fresh, more direct way. So it's all useful. I think my photography informed the film work, and then therefore the film work I did informed my photography, and I don't see them as separate.
That's amazing, because I'm thinking about what Robert commented earlier about scale, I can't help but think of, I remember seeing Salam Bombay. It reminded me immediately of the trilogy of Apu, Steidl Verlag, and then look at the lens of early films when Merchant Ivory just barely met Ishmael Merchant. James Ivory came to India probably in, I would say, late 50s, because when you look at the early film like Sexuala, Householder, are really a split between the Merchant being Indian and then James Ivory being English. So there's an incredible combination of that clarity, epic, where it sort of reminded us so much of his early admiration for David Lean, But I'm thinking about your work now. It's somehow it seems to have both eyes on wherever you go to, whether Vietnam or India and elsewhere. It's fascinating.
Well, I think that it's, Salam Bombay was so much more complex as a piece of work than anything that I had done on my own up until that point. And so it paved the way in terms of showing the tremendous value of collaboration. And I think also, gave me a longer view of where I could go with my work to allow it to be more ambitious and to deepen as I made bodies of work that could be telling in a way that was more than a single photograph. And I think that that's what is evidenced with property rights, and as I referenced the project about my father, family business. Film was very helpful to me in those very specific ways. So,
well, thank you
for bringing that up, and thank you for hosting this creative venue for so many of us to participate in and to grow with together.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Thank you, Robert. I feel like I'm learning so much from you guys. It's like a free graduate school. It's really awesome. Thank you so much. Back to you, Nikki.
Thank you, Phong, and thank you, Mitch, for your generosity today. And thank you, Robert, for wonderfully hosting us. As is the Rails tradition, we close our community events with a poetry reading. I am honored to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Charles Valle. Writer Charles Valle was born in Manila, Philippines, and immigrated to California when he was 7 years old. Since 2006, he has served as one of the poetry editors at Fence magazine, and his work has been featured in numerous publications, which we will link to in the chat. Valle lives in Portland, Oregon, where he is a change maker for Nike. His first book of poetry, Proof of Stake, is forthcoming from Phonograph Editions, and he also joined our radical poetry reading with Paulo Javier in June, which we will also link to. But without further ado, Charles, the floor is yours.
Hey guys, thank you so much, Mitch and Robert. That was really fantastic. And thanks, Brooklyn Rail, for having me. Yeah, the book came out. It's available on the Academician website. So it's basically one long poem. It's an elegy. My daughter died 10 years ago. I have a sprawling elegy talking a lot about diasporas and disruptive technologies, social unrest, a little bit of everything. So I'm going to read a couple sections from there.
Charles, before you get started, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but it's possible there might be something on the microphone on your laptop.
Yeah.
Some paper.
Does that sound better?
Yes, beautiful. Thank you so much.
All right. This is what I thought our lives would be going through motions, checking boxes, striking through lists like crossing the Brooklyn Bridge, strolling through Buckingham Palace, watching the sun rise over Angkor Wat or descending on Machu Picchu, all silhouettes and golden light, bathing desolate ruins of empires. This is the age of desolation tourism, or this is the age of disintegration voyeurism, or this is the age of experiential inequity. What stage capitalism? How do we unfuck ourselves? Can we place faith in such incremental change when the men behind the invisible hands maintain such solid grips on the stage curtains? There are backdrops in front of the backdrops, scrims in front of scrims, grand drapes becoming false proscenia. The production's so complex, the audience is forced into performance. The chorus into stagehands. The producers are picking up trumpets and trombones. The financiers are conducting the orchestra. The actors are changing directions. Even the absurdity unfolding in front of the false proscenium is confused for reality. The central banks have succeeded in redefining the theater of cruelty. The confusion so perfect. The audience is too busy tapping hashtags instead of throwing tomatoes or burning down the proscenium arch. They keep killing Black people, and I need the Wi-Fi password. They're bombing the wedding party again, and I need to charge my devices. They put us in lockdown again, and I'm at 1%. Hashtag SPX wins again, all-time highs. We're dying here. Hashtag please send nudes. How can we break free from manufactured dissent, sanctioned by the DNC, powered by FANG? How do empires fall? Think of lineage now. Think of diasporas and Reconquista, oaken and ashen histories, shorn or sheared, stories scribbled on Chinese paper, not populist pulp, but mulberry bark, perhaps hemp rags, the detritus of fishnets, Cy Loon and his guarded recipe. And maybe this is the story of adoption and penetration. And maybe this is the story of mistaking innovation for iteration. How paper traveled west, then north, before heading back. Oh, you lovely caryatids with your tongue-tied titty twisters. Oh, cacophonous caliphate, recalling Ibrahim in verse or Abraham in song. In the cave of double caves, double tombs become sanctuaries. Basilica becomes mosque, becomes synagogue. A cenotaph here, a minaret there. Build more words and cut a quill and angle to a point how paper killed parchment and erasure. For the dye bleeding through dried pulp implies transparency and transaction, implies an imagined permanence. For what is smudge on dead skin? Mistakes, misshapes, and my mind is smudgy pulp, all flayed remnants of brown skin, incoherent thoughts, projections of paternal aptitude, the detritus of hope, macerated, pressed, and dried. There are no words. And I'll just end a little section here that sections about the photographs of the BLM really made me think of the section I wrote in the end of the book. It's 2019 and there's a man who wants me to go back to where I came from. There's a man who wants to call me and I'm not even there's a man who wants to teach me a lesson on supremacy. It's 2020 and the unctuous dreams unravel. The kids are toppling statues and monuments of old slavers and Confederate generals, some decapitated, some defaced, others decomposing in lakes and rivers. Reckoning after reckoning, Oregon is on fire, Michigan is underwater, climate disaster is the new norm. The socially distanced food lines keep growing, yet increasing less than the billionaires' coffers. Everything feels historical. our empathic stores looted, moral reserves drained, essentialness always already redefined. And in certain ways, I'm grateful that grief has become so decentralized, that everyone has a stake in the validation of loss. There are people who want me to believe in one history. They want us to become horribly synchronous again, as if we can ever negotiate the divide between those in power and the collection of peoples who mark time's passage by paycheck or harvest. I want to find a way out of time, a formless, lifeless photograph, perhaps, the opposite of decisive moments. I want to escape the photographer's gaze and reorganize the forms, the lines, the landscapes. I want to strike back and destroy the recognizable patterns, the letters, the histories. I want to invent a new plasticity of language, of movements, of motions, of grief, and strike these words to widen the aperture, to blur the background, all that baggage and buttery bouquet, unrecognizable, dark, more dark. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Charles. Nick, sorry to cut in, but I'm wondering, Charles, could you take a moment to explain the book, where folks can find it, and what inspired it?
Yeah, for sure. So the book's available through my publisher's website. It's Phonograph Edition, available on through SPD, small press distribution. I think it's on Amazon. It's available through several different ways. But yeah, the book, you know, as I said earlier, my daughter died back in 2010, and you know, it was a really big struggle in many ways, personally and creatively, right? As a poet, trying to break away from a lot of the pieces where they weren't so personal. And so, you know, this elegy, it's called Proof of Stake. I don't know if you guys are into cryptocurrency at all. Proof of Stake is basically like a consensus mechanism as opposed to proof of work, meaning that people have to have something they have to have a stake within that transaction. And a lot of that is, you know, really thinking through about how disruptive technologies, and I go into a lot of like paper is really disruptive technology, right? When you think about how parchment was really used in validating kind of transactions, and how paper was so disruptive in that. And so that plays a pretty prominent role in the book. There's a lot about, you know, my kind of history being Filipino, a lot of Filipino history in there. So it's quite a layered, dense book in many ways. But yeah, it's a pretty quick read in many ways because it is just one long poem.
Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing your work with us. And thank you, Malvika, for helping to expertly resolve that microphone issue quickly. So thank you again. And I want to thank, of course, Mitch and Robert. Thank you for joining us today. We are here every day at 1 p.m. Please join us on Monday for a conversation between Whitney Museum Director Adam Weinberg with the Rail's own Helen Lee and Joaquin Pizarro. I also posted in the chat, we have an event this weekend with Lauren Bond and Metabolic Studio to commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So there's more information there as well. And I want to thank you all for joining, and you can all now turn on your microphones to say hello and goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
you.
you. Everyone.
Thank you.
It was great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Charles. Great reading.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you,
Thanks,
Robert.
Robert. Thanks, Mitch.
Thank you. Beautiful talk.
Thank you guys so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Robert.
Good to be there. Thank you.
Awesome. It was so great. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Joanne.
Get you back forever, every day. Woo! Thank you. Thanks for reading too, Charles.